This video is going to be going over how we add and subtract complex numbers. So we're going to start with looking at this on the complex plane. This diagram that we have here to the left represents the addition of the complex numbers 2 plus 3i plus negative 8 plus minus 8i. So the first thing I want you to look for is, how do you see 2 plus 3i represented in this diagram? Take a second and see what you think. If you remember back to when we graphed complex numbers, 2 plus 3i, I would move 2 on the real number line, so that would be 2 to the right, and then 3 in the imaginary axis direction, so that would be up 3. So 2 plus 3i would be represented by that point right there. And so that's kind of where we see it on this diagram we've been given. And now, how do we see the negative 8 minus 8i represented? Because I don't see arrows that are pointing left 8, down 8, starting at 0. But I do see an arrow that points left 8. That's right here. And I do see one that points down 8 then, following that. But notice that instead of these arrows starting at 0, they start at the point 2 plus 3i. So this diagram, when you put it all together, it represents starting with 2 plus 3i and then adding negative 8 minus 8i to that first point. And so if we look at point A, which complex number does this represent? Well, it does represent the addition of these two complex numbers, but specifically when we look at the complex plane, I go to the left 6 and then down negative 5. So this would be negative 6 minus 5i. That's the complex number at point I. Now let's go ahead and try, in question 4, it says to add like terms in this expression. So when we add like terms, it's kind of similar to when we add like terms with variables. But here our like terms would be the real numbers are all like terms with each other, and then the imaginary numbers are the other like term. So when I add like terms, I always like to start with the real numbers first, because if you remember, our standard form for these complex solutions is real plus imaginary for complex numbers. So I'm going to start with the real numbers. The real number in the first complex number is 2, and the real number in the second one is negative 8. So 2 plus negative 8 is negative 6. Now I'll combine the imaginary like terms. So 3i minus 8i. And again, this works kind of like with variables. We'll do 3 minus 8, which is negative 5i. And if you see here, it's the same thing that we got before, negative 6 minus 5i. So you can look at addition and subtraction in a diagram, or you can kind of find it by hand. So this next one, we're going to do another addition. We're going to start by doing it by hand, and then we can draw a diagram. So we want to begin by combining like terms, starting with the real terms. So we've got a negative 3 in the first complex number and a positive 4 in the second. Negative 3 plus 4 is positive 1. Now I'm going to combine the imaginary like terms. I've got plus 2i and minus 5i. 2 minus 5 is negative 3i. Now let's go ahead and represent this on the diagram. So we're going to start with the negative 3 plus 2i first. I'm going to go with negative 3 on the real axis and then plus 2i on the imaginary. And that gets us to this point right here. That's the first complex number. But now we're going to add the next complex number to that point. So I'm going to start with 4 on the real axis. So 1, 2, 3, 4. And then we're going to go negative 5 in the imaginary direction. So that'll be down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And when we put that together, we go right 1 and down 3 to get the complex number 1 minus 3i, which is what we had found. Now let's do subtraction. So when we subtract complex numbers, there is one extra step because we're not just subtracting the real portion of the complex number, we're subtracting the whole complex number that's in parentheses. And so what we need to be sure to do is to distribute that subtraction to both the real number and the imaginary number. So we get -1 minus 2i. And bring down that 6 minus 5i. Now that I've distributed the negative, I can combine like terms. So I'll start with the real terms. 6 minus 1 is 5. And then the imaginary, -5i minus 2i is -7i. Now let's represent this on the diagram. So I've got 6 minus 5i first. I'm going to go in the +6 direction on the real axis. And then I'll go in the -5 direction on the imaginary axis. And that gets us this point right here. And now we're going to subtract 1 plus 2i. So you can kind of distribute that negative in your head, or you can do it step by step. We're going to subtract the real number 1. So that's going to be left 1 from that real direction. And then I'm going to subtract the imaginary number 2i. So that's going to be down 2 in the imaginary direction. And that gets us the complex point right here. Let's just double check. To get to that point, we would move right 5 and then down 7 for the complex number 5 minus 7i, which is what we got.